So today I will talk about literacy practices in adolescent learners by myself, Thomas Messenger. Here's how I'm going to organize it. I'm going to give you a brief context of myself and my own school and where I teach at currently. I'm going to pose the dilemma and the guiding question of today's presentation. I'm going to give you 13 practical solutions to my dilemma and question. Embedded in the solutions will be key takeaways from every source I read and implications for your own practice as well as my own. I throw in some possible questions from educators, questions that you may even have as you watch the presentation. I kind of conclude by talking about the next steps of an educator, what you can take away, and what I'm taking away from this, and end with my work cited. So my context, I teach at a 6 through 12 charter school in San Diego, 100% free and reduced lunch. Almost 60% of our students are English language learners, with the majority of those being refugees from all over. So people always ask me, well, where are they majority from? Everywhere. East African countries, Afghanistan, Burma, Iraq, Nepal, everywhere. About 50% Hispanic, and about 17% with special needs. To give you kind of an example, last year I taught a U.S. history class for high school, and of my 21 students, 2 were at grade level reading, 5 were above, and 14 of my students were below, and 7 of those below grade level were below a second grade reading level. And so that's my context. Here's my question. When I teach an adolescent learner, an English language learner, student that speaks a language like Somali, Kurdish, Tigrinya, etc., and they don't have literacy skills in their first language, what are the best practices to help them succeed in high school? So to break down this question I'm focusing on high school and adolescent English language learners, but those that may speak like a language that is not commonly known or used, like for example, Tigrinya. A couple of my students speak that. It's a language from a people group in Ethiopia, and there's no written form of that. So many of my students at Spring Tigrinya don't have literacy skills in their first language. So what do you do in that situation? They're an English language learner, but they don't have literacy skills in their L1. Fu kind of puts this into context, which is among the hundreds of English language learners at all levels I've interviewed over the past 2 decades, those who were good writers in their native language learned to write in English more rapidly and with less frustration, and many of them were eventually enjoyed writing in English. So this is amazing. It says that those who have literacy skills in their home language or first language, it would hopefully translate to English. But again, my question is, what if they don't have literacy skills in their home language? Again, the dilemma I phrase here is it takes about 5 to 7 years to develop academic language proficiency, 2 to 3 years just to develop social language proficiency, that just being conversation with their peers. Students in high school have less time to learn. I mean, if you start 9th grade, you have only 4 years, but it takes 5 to 7 to develop academic proficiency. The curriculum in high school is very content heavy. So you have classes like biology, chemistry, calculus, very content heavy. There's high pressure to perform with tests like the SAT, AP tests, and SBAC, honors classes, those type of things. And usually in today's culture, school culture, there's less flexibility to modify the curriculum of the Common Core state standards, especially with those that don't have like a IEP. And so that's kind of puts the dilemma more into some context. So again, here's the question. How do I teach an adolescent learner that speaks a not so common language that doesn't have literacy skills in their first language? So here we go. Number 1, Fu kind of introduces this in her first 2 chapters, but I called it empowerment mindset. And so the idea was, Fu has this quote: I believe that to enhance writing development, we need to start from what students can do. And so she even quotes Maul and his colleagues that talk about the funds of knowledge mindset. So this idea is, don't look at what the students can't do, but as teachers, it will be overwhelming if we focus on that, but we need to start focusing on what students can do. And so as you get to know your students, see what they can do and start from there. And so that's just kind of a mindset to grapple this, to frame this conversation. 2, Fu talks about how you got to treat each case differently. She says that her book is geared towards teaching those English that have literacy skills in their first language. But she talks about how she met with teachers and talked to different teachers, and she said there's no like direct, you know, one size fits all methodology to teaching what she calls SIFE students. So she says treat each case differently, and so you really gotta, like I said, in the empowerment mindset, you gotta go based on what the student can do first. And start where they are. She says start where they are no matter how old they are. So even if they're ninth or 10th grade, start where they are, not where you hope they will be, or not where they, the ninth grade level. So with that, a third thing is use informal reading and writing assessments. So use the QR reading inventory to get a baseline on their strengths with both narrative and expository texts. Use Words Their Way. You can get a spelling inventory, and that can help you start to break down maybe where they are with sounds and phonics and different things like that. So that can even directly correlates to helping them with reading. Kind of have a student do a writing sample, and if they can't write, then draw, like, and anything they can write, any words they know, even if it's just their name, like assess where they are in their writing, or be able to communicate through drawing. Get to know your students on a personal level. This goes back to each case is different, so what language do they speak? Um, is it because do they not have literacy skills in their first language because there's no written form of the language, or because that interrupted schooling? I get to know their situation. Get to know their siblings. What are their siblings like, and where are they at, and find more about the student's academic history through records and parent meetings. I found this very helpful. Fu outlines this in her chapter 2 of her book, but really what you have here is you correlate native English speaking children and their learning progression to those learning English as a first language. And so I think this is a helpful diagram to use to kind of help figure out where your student is. And so with this, if a student has literacy in their first language, you're kind of looking on this progression here. But she says if they don't have literacy in their first language, you almost treat them like they're a child learning the language. So, first start with oral language, and then just have them write, but invent the spelling. And then they can actually kind of start writing it out on paper, but it may not be formal writing, but more conversational based. And so this is a helpful diagram to use. This up here is if your student has literacy in their first language. This is if they don't. And so use this framework to help figure out kind of where your student's at. This was kind of Fu's main thesis in her writing, but allow the student to complete the assignment orally in their first language. So if the student speaks Tigrinya and they're writing, doing a writing assignment about the Civil War, allow them just to tell you their answer. Allow it in their first language, even though you don't understand it. Second thing you can do is you can have them complete the assignment orally in English. So have them tell you about the Civil War in English. They can write, if they're able to write a little bit in their L1, they can write about it. Or they can invent spelling using their first language, using English to write about the assignment. So giving flexibility to your students is going to go a long way. And that goes back to just seeing, using every aspect of what they can do to help them engage in the writing activity. Rather than say, oh, you can't speak English, you can't write in English, well, I guess you're not doing the assignment. Helping the student figure out the skills they have in order to complete the task. So this is allowing Fu's big argument too, is allowing students to think and learn in their L1. So he talks about how learning in the first language enables English language learners to obtain new knowledge. And so if a student can read in their L1, then great. They can read different resources in their first language. If not, then maybe have a student that speaks the same language as them teach them the content, by translating it into their language. And so, if there's no official, like for example, Tigrinya, I couldn't find a translation of a Civil War document in Tigrinya. Well, why don't I have another student that speaks Tigrinya teach the student what we're learning? And so, have them utilize their first language and the skills they have in their first language to learn the content. That way, they're able to maybe discuss about the content with their peers. They're able to learn about the content and grapple with the depth of it. And so Fu even talks about how these thinking skills will then translate over to English as they master it. Again, student Fu's just gives some quick tips for students with interrupted formal education. These are students that don't have literacy in their first language. So allow students to use art to express themselves, use English pattern books to teach sentence patterns, add labels or captions to the art. So, have them draw pictures and then they can even name the pictures. That could even be in their first language. Encourage them to write as they speak. And so, as they're writing, just say it and then write down what they say. Allow code switching. So allow students to use both languages as they express themselves in writing, or even speaking for that matter. And then Fu talks about this too, is give the students picture books to help them understand the content and have them discuss with peers. She talks about how we need to just go away from having students read textbooks to having students read different level books about the same topic so they all can discuss about it. And then also she talks about how students should write daily. She talks about how a lot of students, only get like less than an hour a week in all their classes to write. So have them write daily, quick writes, journals, summaries, reflections, that students should be writing daily. So this was based on a presentation. I didn't see the presentation, but I got the slides for it for Bernice Morrow. And she talks about six scaffolding strategies, and I'll go into those now. She talks about how modeling is huge. So demonstrate the skill to your students. I do, we do, you do, model. Use think alouds. So think aloud in front of the students. You can even show students examples of what's previously been done, and that's helpful. Bridge. So think about what do your students know, activate their prior knowledge. What do they know about the topic? Use quick writes, KWL charts, think, pair, share. But you're creating a personal link. So how can you link the Civil War to maybe them and their culture? And so contextualization, use analogy, manipulatives, videos, pictures. Again, creating a personal link between the student and the learning. A schema building is explain the content. So like if you're reading an article, preview the text, break down the headings, explain kind of the way the text is structured. Metacognition, we'll go into this later on, but teach students to self-monitor and evaluate their own learning. And then this was a very interesting one for me, is text re-representation. Is, let's say they're reading a article on the Civil War, have them turn that into a story or have them turn it into a picture. Take what they learned from the text and turn it into a picture, turn it into a story, turn it into a comic, turn it into a play to demonstrate learning. And those are, look at the DOK model, that's a deep level of understanding of the content in order to, turn expository text into a narrative. I read an article about, test taking and whether or not the basic idea was, do students do better on time tests, or do they do better when they are not timed, with writing? And the basic idea that they found from the study was that giving students more time, and it shouldn't come as a surprise, on the writing activities increases the quality of their tests in a meaningful way. And so the study found out that kids were basically spending more time revising higher level things, so actually diving into the ideas of their writing. But in time situations, students their revisions were more like fixing spelling errors and kind of like what they called surface level revisions. And so the takeaway here is, especially with students that may not have literacy skills in their L1, is give them more time. Push deeper into their thinking, so they're revising more the meaning rather than just the grammar. And Fu made a comment, or she had a quote where she said, "Teach writers, don't teach them to write." And so really empowering the writing there. This is Cummings' article. He talks about decoding. And so another key idea, takeaway, I said, focus more on just decoding. And so he talks about just classic skill and drill, worksheets. You have, let's say you're learning about prepositions and you give the kids a worksheet about prepositions. They do the worksheet, they master it, and they move on. But it talks about how that actually doesn't have long-lasting effects on reading comprehension. So with your English language learners, and especially with English language learners, they tend, because they're reading at a lower level, they tend to just get phonics instruction. And so the idea here is with your students is don't just focus on decoding. Um, Teach them decoding within their actual reading. And so um, he outlines 4 things that provide large amounts of time for actual reading, teach comprehension strategies, have them read together in peers, do small teacher conferences, teach Greek and Latin root words, and expose kids to different genres. So don't just focus on skill and drill worksheets, especially with your English language learners that don't have literacy skills in L1. Is don't just give them worksheets, give them authentic reading situations and teach them the skills within that context. Which is, it's harder, right? It's easier to give a kid a worksheet, but this is more authentic teaching and learning. So this is zone of proximal development. This was outlined in an article by Aida Walke. I believe I'm saying her name correctly, but basically scaffolding. So modeling, teacher models to the students. And so you have a professional teaching the students. Then you have interaction with peers at their level or even peers above their level. So, and then you can even have a student at a higher level teach a student at a lower level. And that's helping both students. The student at a high level is teaching by learning, and the student at a lower level is learning by their teaching. And then you can have them work on their own and kind of see where they're at on their own there. So you can use these different models with your students that don't have literacy skills as model to them. Have them interact with their peers at all levels, have them being taught by a higher level peer, and then have them work on their own and see where they're at. A big takeaway, and why I put it at the end, is metacognition. I think this is key and huge, is basically a idea to monitor one's current level of understanding. So teaching your kids explicit metacognition skills. So teach them how to stop and edit their work, teaching them to think aloud, to know when to ask for help, to know when to clarify. Using reciprocal teaching, summarizing, asking questions, clarifying, reflecting on their work and planning for, making goals for the future. And also teaching kids how to use their resources. So if you give the kids, like, let's say a rubric, teach your kids how to actually use that rubric. And so I'm ending with this because I think this frames it all. As Walke ends her whole article with this: we may have covered less, but in the end, we have covered more. So I think, especially with students that don't have literacy in their first language, but I think all students, as teachers, we tend to feel this pressure to really go fast and cover everything because we have to get kids, we teach the test. But really, here, this idea and framing all this is go slow, cover less, but go deeper. And so I think this applies to my question, but I think this applies to all students, where you don't feel the pressure just to move on. Going slower actually may allow kids to actually learn. Basically, teach until kids are learning. And so don't move on just because your curriculum map says that, or that's what the curriculum says, or that's what really teach the kids. And so here's some possible questions for educators. What if I can't understand their writing? If they're writing in their L1, they're speaking in Integrinia, I don't understand it. Fu basically answers this and says, and she poses this question, but writing in their L1 or invented spelling is a way to help them grow as writers. And so basically you're focusing not on like yourself, but you're focusing on, hey, this understanding that students writing their L1, I may not fully understand it, but it is helping them. And that's the goal. You can assess work. Some teachers in Fu's school, they grade on effort rather than contents. You don't need to read all the writing. Students can even just authentically share their writing in groups, and especially focus on ideas, not grammar. So especially with students that lack literacy skills in their L1, you don't want them to have this mindset that there's a correct way to do things. And they'll get so hung up on the correct way and won't actually learn that way. So allow students to participate in peer and teacher conferences and share their work with the class. And those are ways to basically assess the writing without actually, spending all this time grading. How do I allow this with Common Core state standards or, no child left behind era? So Fu puts this quote, and she basically talks about how, it's true in this era that Many schools have to teach the standards rather than the potential students. But no matter what the political climate is, we as educators with conscience and responsibility should always find ways to reach our students. So she basically makes a framework of, like, hey, I'm a 10th grade history teacher, and I have to teach Common Core 10th grade standards. So that means all my kids with no literacy skills in their first language or English will fail. And she says, no, as teachers, we have a moral obligation to teach students, not to just throw out expectations upon them. And so I think that's huge. And I think that's a huge release for teachers to go, yes, it's important. Standards are good and helpful, and you have to honor what your school does, but you also have to teach. And just telling kids the expectation, but not actually providing them with the scaffolds in order to reach those is not empowering them. Um, Next steps for myself. So here's what I take away from this. Like I said, and I begin with, I had 7 students last year that were reading below a second grade reading level in a high school classroom, and I really struggled with this. And so I think, for one, it's just the empowerment mindset. So coming in and thinking, well, what can these students do? What can I celebrate about these students? I'm also using informal assessments to see their growth and show them their growth. And so celebrate with them. I think that's a huge thing, just a positivity mindset. Students that have low literacy skills in their home first language and second language probably have low self-esteem, and they Fu even talks about how they're more likely to drop out of school. And so really bringing a positive mindset into that instruction, I think, is huge. I also think it's helpful to have the 4 stages of English language learner writing development. I'm actually going to print that thing out, put it on a clipboard so I can look at it every day just to reference. Okay, I think the student is inventing spelling. This is where they're at. They lack literacy skills. I should focus on this with them. It's tough, but I'm going to allow my students to use their first language in their writing and art. So, that may mean their assignment looks different, but I've just kind of, as I've done this research, realized, like I said in the last one, is Fu talked about how we have a moral obligation to teach our students. And so it may not mesh perfectly with the standards I'm teaching, but it's meeting the student where they're at. And so I really want to encourage students, hey, you can write in Arabic and then write a couple sentences in English, or draw a picture of the Civil War. I want to use those 6 scaffolding strategies of modeling. I want to model with the I do, we do. Really focus on think alouds. I want to bridge to where they're at, especially focusing on metacognition strategies. I think that's super helpful, is to teach kids to think aloud. And as they're thinking aloud, then the teachers can see I can see their thought process, but more importantly, they can see their thought process. I want to give more time for writing assignments and not just, to really focus on going deep with the kids. And I think all this is framed in this mindset of less is more. So like Fu said, is we may cover less, but we will uncover more. And so that framework is constant reminding, hey, I don't need to put pressure. I need to take this pressure off myself and the pressure off these students and really teach them so they can actually learn. Here are my references. These are the articles that I read, and to be honest, these are really great. And so I would encourage anyone that may have any relevance to what I brought up to read these articles. And we all read the Fu book for our class, but I really encourage you guys to read these articles. They're super helpful. So hope you guys learned a lot and enjoyed this presentation.